The year was 1887, and the wind in Dry Creek, Nevada, had a personality. It was a mean, whining thing, a constant thief that stole the moisture from a man's skin and the hope from his heart. It carried the red dust of the desert everywhere, sifting it through the cracks in the walls of the small, sun-bleached train station, coating the water in the horse trough with a gritty film, and painting the horizon in a perpetual haze of rust. The only sound that ever truly challenged the wind was the lonesome wail of the westbound train, a mournful cry that promised a world beyond this forgotten spit of land, but rarely stopped long enough to deliver on it. For 40 days, that sound had been both the torment and the only comfort for Evelyn Grant. She sat on a bench at the far end of the platform, a place she had claimed through sheer, stubborn persistence. At 22, she should have been blooming, but the desert had already begun to parch her. Her dress, once a hopeful cornflower blue, was now the color of the dust itself, frayed at the hem and cuffs. Her face was thin, her cheekbones sharpened by a hunger that had become a dull, constant companion. Yet, in the careful way she pinned her honey-colored hair each morning and the unwavering straightness of her spine as she sat, there remained a splinter of defiance. She was not a vagrant. She was waiting. Her life had shrunk to the dimensions of this station platform. Mornings were for watching the station master's wife shake out rugs, hoping a few crumbs from a breakfast roll might fall her way. Midday was for the well, a brackish, iron-tasting water source she shared with the horses. She would wait until no one was looking to splash her face and arms, the brief coolness of fleeting luxury. Afternoons were for watching the tracks, twin ribbons of steel that shimmered and warped in the heat, stretching west into an unforgiving infinity. In her pocket, her fingers would worry the edges of a train ticket to Wyoming. It was a one-way passage. Meant for a bride, it was a lie she had been living with for 40 days. Her intended, a man with a smooth tongue and smoother promises, had left her on this very bench with a vow to return with his carriage. He never did. Each day was a perfect, cruel copy of the one before it. The townsfolk of Dry Creek had moved from pity to suspicion to outright contempt. She was a fixture of their landscape now, as unremarkable and irritating as a tumbleweed caught against a fence. She had a name for them in her mind. The woman with the pinched face who stared, the men who lounged by the general store, their whispers like the dry rustle of snakes, the station master, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose patience had been worn down to a nub. On the 40th day, a man named Caleb Hart saw her for the first time. Not that he had not been through Dry Creek before. He hauled freight for the railroad, his wagon a familiar sight. But he was a man who did not waste his attention. At 33, his face was a map of hard miles and quiet sorrows, carved by sun and wind. He moved with an economy of motion, his silence as profound as the desert itself. A long, pale scar ran down the side of his neck, disappearing into the collar of his shirt, a silent testament to a story he never told. He was guiding his team of mules toward the water trough when he saw the station master marching toward the girl on the bench. Mr. Abernathy stopped in front of Evelyn, his hands on his hips, his belly straining the buttons of his vest. His shadow fell over her like a verdict. "That is enough," he said, his voice loud enough for the loafers at the store to hear. 40 days. My charity has its limits. Miss Grant, this is a place of business, not a poorhouse. Evelyn stood up slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. Her gaze did not waver. "I am not asking for charity. Sir, I am a paying customer who is waiting." Abernathy let out a bark of a laugh. "Waiting. Waiting on a ghost. The whole town knows your story. He is not coming back. You are a freeloader, an embarrassment. I want you gone, now." He gestured vaguely out toward the desert, as if she could simply dissolve into the heat and dust. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked Evelyn's eyes. But she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. She had cried them all out in the first week. Now, all that was left was a brittle, hollow shell. "Where am I to go?" she asked. her voice quiet but clear. "That is not my concern," the station master snapped. "Go back where you came from." He turned and stalked back toward his office. The matter settled in his mind. The men at the store snickered. The woman with the pinched face, who had been sweeping her porch, paused to watch, her expression one of grim satisfaction. Caleb Hart watched the whole exchange, his face impassive. He had seen cruelty before, in all its plain and ugly forms. It was part of the fabric of this land. He saw the girl stand there for a long moment, swaying slightly, a lone, slender reed in the merciless wind. He felt a distant, unwelcome stirring of something he had long since buried. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition. He knew what it was to be left alone in the ashes. Evelyn eventually turned and walked, not toward the town, but further down the platform, away from the prying eyes. She stopped near the end of the tracks, where the creosote bushes began their tenacious crawl out of the sand. A small boy, the blacksmith's son, timidly approached her and held out a biscuit. He had seen the encounter, and his mother had nudged him forward. Evelyn looked at the offering, then at the boy's earnest face. She shook her head gently. "Thank you, but I am fine." The boy looked confused. "But you must be hungry." She gave a small, sad smile that did not reach her eyes. She looked down the endless tracks. "I am not waiting for a meal," she said, more to herself than to the child. "I am waiting for someone to buy me a ticket." She paused, and her voice dropped to a whisper filled with a strange, broken poetry. "A ticket to forever." Caleb had finished watering his mules and was leading them away when her words drifted over to him. A ticket to forever. The phrase caught in his mind like a burr. It was the sort of foolish, fanciful thing a person might say before the world taught them that forever was a lie. He knew that better than anyone. Forever was the smell of burning pine and cotton, the sound of a roof collapsing. Forever was the face of his wife, Eleanor, in his memory, a face he was terrified of one day forgetting. He had walled his heart off with stone and silence after the fire had taken her, taken everything. He did not believe in love anymore. It was a fever that led only to grief, a house built in the path of a wildfire. He tethered his team and went about his business, unloading sacks of flour and barrels of nails. But the image of the girl and her ridiculous, heartbreaking words stayed with him. He saw the set of her jaw, the pride that cost her a meal, the profound loneliness in her eyes. He told himself it was not his concern. He had his own ghosts to carry. As the day bled into evening, the sun swelled and turned a violent shade of orange. Setting the sky ablaze, the heat finally began to relent, and the world was cast in long, dramatic shadows. The red dust hanging in the air caught the light, and for a few breathtaking moments, Dry Creek was bathed in a light that seemed to be filtered through blood and gold. Evelyn stood on the platform, watching the spectacle. The sunset felt like a grand, final curtain. It was the end of the 40th day, the end of hope. The number had a biblical finality to it that she could not ignore. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the ticket to Wyoming. The ink was faded, the edges soft from her constant touch. It was a promise of a new life, a home, a husband. It was a worthless piece of paper. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, feeling its lightness. It was nothing, a dead dream. With a sudden, calm resolve, she opened her hand. The wind, ever present, snatched the ticket from her grasp. It fluttered for a moment, a pale moth in the crimson light, before tumbling across the weathered planks of the platform, coming to rest against the leg of an empty bench. She did not watch to see where it landed. She turned her back on the tracks, on Wyoming, on the ghost of the man she thought she had loved. With her head held high, she walked off the platform and toward the deepening twilight, with no destination in mind, only the certain knowledge that she could not stay. She was no longer waiting. The platform was deserted now, silent save for the sighing of the wind. From the shadows near the freight wagon, Caleb Hart emerged. He had seen her let the ticket go. He walked slowly across the platform, his boot heels making a hollow sound on the wood. He stopped at the bench and looked down. The ticket was there, a small rectangle of white against the darkening wood. He bent down, his movement stiff, and picked it up. He smoothed it out, reading the words printed there. Cheyenne, Wyoming, a place he had never been. He thought of the girl's whispered words. A ticket to forever. A fool's notion. But as he stood there, alone in the vast, indifferent twilight of the desert, he folded the piece of paper carefully and slipped it into his breast pocket. He did not know why. It was just a ticket. It meant nothing. Yet, it felt heavy, like the weight of a life he had refused to notice until now. He found her less than a quarter mile from the station, sitting on an overturned water barrel behind the livery stable. She had chosen the spot for its anonymity, for the way the shadows gathered, offering a thin veil against the world. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture as straight and unyielding as it had been on the platform bench. She seemed to be staring at nothing, a statue carved from dust and disappointment. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and she did not bother to brush it away. Caleb approached slowly, his boots scuffing quietly in the dirt. He was not a man comfortable with intruding, but leaving her here to be swallowed by the night felt like a different kind of wrong. He stopped a few feet away, holding a small, grease-stained paper parcel. The smell of fried bacon and fresh bread wafted from it, a shockingly potent aroma in the dry air. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, unused to gentle address. Evelyn started, her head snapping up, her eyes wide and wary in the gloom, fixed on him. She recognized him as the freighter from the station. A flicker of fear crossed her face, the instinct of a woman alone and vulnerable. She hugged her arms to her chest. "I do not have any money," she said, her voice a low murmur. Caleb did not move closer. He respected the space she had drawn around herself. He simply held out the parcel. "This is not for sale." Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion clouding her features. In her experience, nothing was free. Kindness, especially from a man, always came with a price tag she could not afford. "I do not accept charity." "It is not charity," he replied, his tone even. "It is supper. A person has to eat." He took a step forward and placed the parcel on the barrel beside her, then retreated to his original spot. "Giving her room. The bacon is probably cold now." For a long moment, she just stared at the package. Her pride was a high, thin wall, and it was crumbling. The scent of the food was a physical assault on her senses, making her stomach clench with a painful, desperate ache. 40 days of gnawing hunger rose up in a single, overwhelming wave. Her hands trembled as she reached for the parcel. Her fingers fumbled with the string. And when she finally opened it, the sight of the thick slices of bacon tucked inside a chunk of bread made her vision swim. She took a small, hesitant bite. The taste was so rich, so real, it was almost too much to bear. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She ate with a slow, deliberate desperation, as if she were afraid the food might vanish. She did not look at him, her shame a palpable heat. Caleb turned his gaze toward the darkening horizon, affording her a measure of privacy. He could hear the small sounds of her eating, and it was a more intimate thing than he had expected. He cleared his throat. "I saw what the station master did," he said, his voice still low. He had no call to do that. Evelyn swallowed a mouthful of bread that felt like sawdust. "He runs the station. He can do as he pleases. Does not make it right." They fell into a silence broken only by the incessant wind. When she finished the last crumb, she carefully folded the paper and placed it beside her. She felt a sliver of strength return, enough to fuel her curiosity. She looked at the man who stood like a sentinel in the twilight. His face was hard to read, all angles and shadows. The scar on his neck was a pale, stark line in the fading light. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Caleb shrugged. a small movement of his broad shoulders. "I told you, a person has to eat." He paused, then added, "Wyoming is a cold place to arrive hungry." Her breath caught in her throat. "How did you know about Wyoming?" "I heard you talking at the station once or twice. Saw the ticket." It was a half-truth. He did not mention that the ticket was now in his pocket. The mention of Wyoming brought the ache of her betrayal rushing back. "I am not going to Wyoming anymore," she said, the words tasting like ash. A shame to waste a ticket. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. The ticket was the least of what was wasted. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw not a threat, but a profound and abiding loneliness that mirrored her own. Something about his quiet presence made her want to speak the truth aloud, perhaps for the first time. "He left me, my fiancé. His family decided I was not luxurious enough for their name. He was to bring a carriage. Instead, a letter came with the train 2 weeks later. It was very polite." She said the last words with a biting sarcasm that was entirely new to her. The humiliation of it, of being weighed and measured and found wanting, was a poison in her blood. Caleb considered her words. He had seen the way of wealthy folks from the East, how they treated people like possessions to be polished or discarded. "Sounds like his family did you a favor," he said simply. His blunt assessment surprised her, and it cut through a layer of her misery. "I suppose that is one way to look at it." She paused. "And you, where do you call home, when you are not hauling freight?" The question seemed to hang in the air between them. Caleb's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. His gaze went distant, looking at a place only he could see. "I do not," he said finally. "Everyone has a home," she countered gently. "Not anymore." The words were flat, final. He turned his head slightly, and the scar on his neck caught the last ray of sunlight. It looked like a streak of moonlight on a dark sea. "I had a wife, a ranch, up north. There was a fire." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The 3 words held a universe of loss. The fire had taken everything, and he had been walking away from the ashes ever since. He never stayed in one place long enough for it to feel like anything but a temporary camp. He had not been back to that part of the country since the day he buried what was left of Eleanor. An understanding passed between them, a recognition of 2 souls marked by loss. They were strangers, yet they had just shown each other their deepest wounds. Evelyn felt a strange kinship with this silent, scarred man. His pain was old and deep, while hers was fresh and raw, but they were cut from the same cloth. "I am sorry," she whispered. He gave a curt nod, accepting the sentiment but not inviting more. He changed the subject. "The eastbound train comes through in an hour. You could be in Salt Lake by morning." "I told you," she said, her voice weary, "I have no money for a ticket." Caleb looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to weigh the truth of her soul. He saw the resilience that had kept her on that platform for 40 days, and the despair that had made her finally walk away. He thought of the words she had whispered to the blacksmith's boy, "A ticket to forever." "Wait here," he said, and before she could protest, he turned and walked back toward the lights of the station, his long strides purposeful. Evelyn watched him go, a knot of confusion and apprehension tightening in her stomach. She did not know whether to run or to stay, but exhaustion had rooted her to the spot. Some 10 minutes later, he returned. He was holding a small, rectangular piece of cardboard in his hand. It was a new ticket. He held it out to her. "This goes to Cheyenne, Wyoming." She stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. "What is this?" "It is a ticket. You paid for it already. I figure, with 40 days of your life." His gaze was direct, unwavering. "Perhaps someone should buy you a ticket to the place you deserve to go." The simple, profound justice of his words broke through the last of her defenses. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of gratitude and grief and overwhelming confusion. The kindness was so unexpected it felt like a blow. She shook her head, pushing his hand away. "No, I cannot accept this." To take it would be to owe him something, and she had nothing left to give. It would be another chain, another man's charity to be trapped by. "There is nothing to accept," Caleb said, his voice firm. "It is just a train ride, a way to start over. No one should be stuck in a place like Dry Creek." He tried to press the ticket into her hand, but she recoiled, standing up abruptly. Tears streamed down her face now, hot and unstoppable. "Please, do not," she begged. "I cannot." As they stood there, locked in this strange struggle of giving and refusing, the wind began to change. It had been a steady, sighing presence all day, but now it picked up a new voice, a low, guttural howl. The air grew thick, the dust swirling in agitated clouds that blotted out the stars. A wall of sand, a churning, monstrous thing, was rising on the horizon, glowing eerily in the moonlight. A sandstorm. The station bell began to clang frantically, a sharp, metallic warning against the rising roar of the wind. A man shouted from the platform, his words torn away by the gale. "Train is held at the junction. Track is buried. Nothing coming or going tonight." The storm was upon them in moments. The air became a blinding, stinging torrent of grit. Caleb grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We need to get inside." He pulled her along, his body shielding hers from the worst of the blast. The livery was too exposed. The station was locked up. He spotted the old freight warehouse, a large, dark shape looming beside the tracks. Its main door was slightly ajar, banging rhythmically in the wind. He half dragged, half carried her toward it, the sand scouring their faces. They stumbled inside, and Caleb put his shoulder to the heavy door, forcing it shut against the might of the storm. The sound was instantly muffled, reduced to a deep, resonant drumming on the roof and walls. They stood in the cavernous, pitch-black space, breathing heavily, the taste of sand in their mouths. The only light was a faint grayness filtering through the grimy, boarded-up windows. The warehouse was empty save for the ghosts of old cargo, the scent of dust, hay, and oil hanging in the still air. "Are you all right?" Caleb's voice was a low rumble in the dark. "Yes," she breathed, though she was trembling from head to foot. He fumbled in his pockets and produced a match. It scraped, flared, and for a brief, flickering moment, his face was illuminated, his features stark and grim. He found an old oil lamp on a crate, its glass chimney miraculously intact. He lit the wick, and a small, steady flame pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting a warm, gentle glow in a small circle around them. The world outside raged, a chaotic symphony of wind and sand. But inside the warehouse, there was a sudden, profound stillness. They were two people, a man and a woman, strangers bound by a storm. There was nothing between them but the soft, flickering light of the lamp and the shared, unspoken knowledge that they were utterly alone together. He sat on one crate, and she, after a moment's hesitation, sank down onto another a few feet away. There were no words to say. He did not look at her with anything resembling desire, only a quiet, watchful concern. She looked at the small, dancing flame and felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in 40 nights, she was not alone. There was no intimacy, no touch, only the simple, undeniable warmth of another human being sharing her shelter, and the silent, steady light of a single lamp holding the vast, screaming darkness at bay. The world was remade in shades of brown. The sun rose on a landscape scoured clean and then buried under a fresh blanket of sand. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light piercing the boarded windows. Evelyn awoke stiff and cold on a pile of old grain sacks, the oil lamp having long since sputtered out. For a disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. Then the memory of the storm, of the man's quiet presence in the dark, returned to her. Caleb was already standing by the great door, a dark silhouette against the bright crack of light he had opened to the new day. He had not slept much, his mind too full of the ghosts the night had stirred, the sight of her sleeping, the absolute trust in her surrender to exhaustion, had been a more unsettling thing than any storm. She stood and brushed the dust from her dress, a futile gesture. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice raspy. "For now," he answered without turning. "The wind always comes back." They stood in an awkward silence, the intimacy of their shared shelter evaporating in the morning light. The world, with all its harsh rules and expectations, was waiting for them just outside the door. Evelyn's eyes fell upon the train ticket to Wyoming, which he had placed on the crate between them before she fell asleep. It sat there, a stark promise and an impossible debt. She walked over and picked it up. She held it not with longing, but with a new and unfamiliar weight of responsibility. "I will not take this as a gift," she said, her voice clear and firm, surprising them both. "But I will learn it." Caleb finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat. "I told you, it is paid for." "Not by me," she insisted. The woman who had waited on a bench for 40 days was gone. In her place was someone who had survived a storm in a dark warehouse and was no longer willing to simply wait for her life to be handed to her. "I will work. I will pay you back every cent." A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance or maybe respect, crossed his face. "There is no work in Dry Creek for a woman like you." "Then I will find work for a woman unlike me," she retorted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I can lift things. I can count. I can sweep. I am stronger than I look." He studied her for a long moment, taking in the slender frame, the determined set of her jaw, the hands that were still soft despite their recent neglect. He saw a stubborn pride that he understood all too well. To argue would be to insult the very thing that was keeping her from shattering. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "All right," he said, "but you will work for the railroad, not for me. I will speak to Abernathy." The station master was, as expected, resistant. He stood in the doorway of his office, his arms crossed over his ample belly, a scowl firmly in place. "Absolutely not. I run a respectable station. I will not have her loitering about, pretending to work." "She will not be loitering," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried an implicit threat of non-cooperation. His freight business was vital to the station. "She will be tallying my cargo as it comes off the wagon, checking it against the manifest. The last shipment was short 2 sacks of flour. Maybe with an extra set of eyes, your inventory will be more accurate." The barb hit its mark. Abernathy's face reddened. He glanced from Caleb's stony expression to Evelyn, who stood behind him, her gaze unwavering. He hated being challenged, but he hated losing money more. "Fine," he spat. "She can work, but she is your responsibility. I want her paid from your freight account, and I do not want any trouble." And so, Evelyn's new life began. It was a life of splintered wood, rough burlap, and the unending battle against the red dust. The work was harder than anything she'd ever known. She learned to brace a crate against her hip, to read the cramped handwriting on shipping manifests, to tie a knot that would hold. Her hands, once destined for needlepoint and piano keys, quickly blistered, then calloused. The sun beat down on her, browning her skin and bleaching streaks in her hair. She was tired in her bones, an exhaustion so deep it was almost peaceful. Each evening, Caleb would pass her a few coins, the exact amount for a simple meal at the town's only diner and a small portion to go toward the ticket. She kept the growing sum tied in a piece of cloth, a tangible measure of her independence. The townsfolk watched this transformation with a mixture of suspicion and scorn. She was no longer the tragic, pitiful figure on the bench. She was an anomaly they could not categorize. Her presence was a constant, unspoken rebuke to their judgment. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. One blistering afternoon, as she was leaving the general store with a loaf of bread, 2 men who were permanently installed on the bench out front made sure she heard them. Well, looky there. One of them, a lanky man named Jed, drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet, the station stray finally earning her keep. His companion, a heavier, slovenly man, snickered. Wonder what kind of work she is really doing for that freighter. He raised his voice, a cruel, taunting sing-song. The girl left at the station who needs her now. The words struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. She froze, her face flaming with shame. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet felt rooted to the dusty street. She clutched the bread to her chest, her knuckles white. She did not see Caleb until he was there. He had been coming out of the blacksmith shop across the street. He moved with a silent, lethal speed that was startling in a man so deliberate. He did not say a word. He simply walked up to the heavy man on the bench, grabbed a handful of his grimy shirt, and threw a single, hard punch. The sound was a sickening crack of bone on bone. The man tumbled backward off the bench, landing in the dust with a grunt, his hand flying to his bloody nose. Jed scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bravado. "Now hold on, Hart. We was just having a bit of fun." Caleb turned his cold, dark eyes on him, and Jed's courage evaporated. He backed away, his hands held up in surrender. The town sheriff, a weary man named Thompson, had heard the commotion and came striding over. "That is enough, Hart," he said, his voice tired. "I cannot have you brawling in the street." Caleb released his grip on the man's shirt, who was now whimpering on the ground. He stood straight, his expression like granite. He insulted the lady. The sheriff sighed, pushing his hat back on his head. He looked at the groaning man, then at Evelyn's stricken face, and finally at Caleb's unrepentant one. "Insults are not a hanging offense. Assault is. That will be a $5 fine. Caleb, pay it at my office." Caleb gave a curt nod, then turned and walked over to Evelyn. He gently took her arm. "Let us go," he said quietly. His touch was firm, protective. He led her away from the staring eyes, leaving the sheriff to deal with the mess. He paid the fine without another word. $5 was a significant sum, nearly a week's wages for her. He had paid it to defend her honor. That night, they sat by the small fire Caleb always built near his wagon. The silence between them was different now, charged with unspoken things. Evelyn noticed a long tear in the shoulder of his shirt, a casualty of the brief, violent struggle. "Your shirt is torn," she said softly. He glanced at it and shrugged. "It happens." "Let me fix it," she offered. "It is the least I can do." He hesitated, then slowly took the garment off. The firelight played across the hard muscles of his back and shoulders. The long, pale scar on his neck seemed to writhe in the flickering light. She took the shirt and, using a small sewing kit she had guarded for 40 days, began to stitch the tear with small, neat stitches. Her head was bent to her task, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. It was a simple, domestic act, yet it felt monumental. As she worked, she saw him watching her, his usual guarded expression softened by something she could not name. In the quiet days that followed, a fragile routine bloomed. They worked, they ate, and in the evenings, they sat by the fire. Their conversations were never long, but they slowly began to fill in the empty spaces of each other's lives. During one of these quiet evenings, while he was cleaning his gear, he took a small, silvered object from his saddlebag. It was a harmonica. He turned it over in his rough hands, his thumb tracing its worn metal casing. "You play?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid to break the spell." He looked up, surprised, as if he had forgotten she was there. He seemed to tuck the instrument, and a part of himself, away. "I used to, a long time ago." "What happened?" she pressed gently. His eyes went to the fire, but he was seeing another fire, another time. It belonged to a different life. There was no more music after the fire. Music was for celebration, for joy, for love. All of those things had been burned away with his home. with his Eleanor. To play now felt like a betrayal, a lie. A few nights later, the relentless work of the day finally caught up to Evelyn after their meal. As she sat listening to the crackle of the fire, her head began to nod. Her body, unaccustomed to such hard labor, simply gave out. She slumped sideways, fast asleep, her cheek resting on a rolled-up blanket. Caleb watched her, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, in sleep. The tension and weariness fell away from her face. She looked younger, softer. She looked peaceful. He saw the faint smudges of dust on her cheek and the calluses forming on her hands, and he felt a powerful, protective ache in his chest. It was an unwelcome feeling, a dangerous thawing around his frozen heart. He looked away, out into the vast, star-filled darkness of the desert, but his gaze was drawn back to her peaceful face. On a sudden impulse he could not explain, he reached into his saddlebag and took out the harmonica. He had not played for another living soul in years. His fingers felt clumsy as he lifted it to his lips. He hesitated, the cold metal a shock against his skin. Then he began to play. It was not a grand or complicated tune. It was a simple, haunting melody, a song of lonely trails and distant campfires. The notes were soft at first, mournful and hesitant, like a man learning to speak again after years of silence. The music drifted out into the immense quiet, a small, human sound against the infinite backdrop of the desert. As he played, the melody slowly changed, the sorrow giving way to a thread of resilience, a quiet, stubborn hope. It was the sound of a heart remembering how to beat. Evelyn stirred in her sleep. She did not wake, but a small, subtle change came over her face. The last traces of worry in the set of her brow seemed to smooth away. And then a small, genuine smile touched the corners of her lips. It was the first true smile he had ever seen from her, a fragile, unconscious expression of peace. It was as if the music, his breath, his very soul, had reached into her dreams and offered a moment of comfort. The sound of the harmonica was the sound of life returning, a gentle rain after a long and brutal drought. He finished the song and lowered the instrument, his own breath catching in his throat. The sight of her smile, a smile he had caused, cracked something open inside him. He was terrified. He had built such high walls to keep the world out, to keep the pain from ever getting in again. But this woman, with her quiet strength and her broken heart, had somehow slipped past his defenses. He looked at her, and he was afraid of the hope that was beginning to flicker in the ashes of his heart, because hope was the kindling for the fires of grief. And across the fire, Evelyn slept on, smiling at a melody in her dreams, but a part of her, deep down, was also afraid. This man's kindness was a shelter, but she had been taught that all shelters were temporary. She feared the day he would ride away, leaving her in a silence far more profound and lonelier than the one he had found her in. She was afraid of being abandoned again, and he was afraid of his heart catching fire once more. The fragile peace they had built was as thin as a layer of morning frost, and just as easily shattered. It was shattered by the shriek of the noon train's whistle, a sound that usually marked the midpoint of their labor. But this train brought more than mail and machine parts. It brought the past, dressed in a fine wool suit and polished boots that were an insult to the dusty platform. Evelyn was counting sacks of grain when she heard his voice, a voice she had once thought the most beautiful sound in the world, now a discordant note that made the hair on her arms stand up. "I am looking for a young woman. Her name is Evelyn Grant. I was told she was left here." She turned slowly, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. There he stood, Charles Worthington, looking entirely out of place and yet completely in his element, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concerned benevolence. Several townspeople, including the station master's wife and the men from the general store, were already gathering, drawn to the drama like moths to a flame. Charles's eyes found her. He did not register shock at her dusty, work-worn appearance. Instead, his gaze swept over her with a flicker of distaste before he resumed his performance. "Ah, Evelyn, my dear. Thank heavens. I have been looking everywhere for you." Evelyn did not move. She felt Caleb's presence beside her, a sudden, solid wall of silent support. He had been loading barrels onto his wagon and had stopped, his posture rigid. His eyes narrowed on the newcomer. "What are you doing here?" Charles Evelyn's voice was low, stripped of all its former affection. "What am I doing?" he feigned surprise. Taking a step toward her, "I have come to bring you home. Of course, and to recover what is mine." He let that last phrase hang in the air. He turned his attention to the small, eager audience. "You see, this dear misguided woman fled from our wedding plans in Boston, but not before taking with her the $500 I had entrusted to her for our future." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. It was a fortune, a sum so vast it was almost mythical in a place like Dry Creek. The accusation was absurd, a lie spun from whole cloth, but it was a sensational one. It landed perfectly, confirming every dark suspicion the town had harbored about the woman on the bench. She was not just abandoned. She was a thief. "That is a lie," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "There was no $500. Charles gave a sad, pitying shake of his head. "My dear, I understand you have been through an ordeal. Perhaps your mind is clouded." He then looked directly at Caleb, his eyes hardening. "And who is this your new protector? Tell me, sir, did she share her stolen wealth with you? Is that the price of your assistance?" Caleb took a half-step forward, his hands clenching into fists. The memory of the $5 fine was fresh in his mind, the bitter irony of it. "You had best watch your mouth," he growled, his voice a low threat. Sheriff Thompson pushed his way through the crowd. "All right, what is all this?" Charles immediately turned to the lawman, his demeanor one of a respectable citizen seeking justice. "Sheriff, my name is Charles Worthington. This woman, my former fiancée, absconded with a significant sum of my money. I have a sworn statement from my bank. I wish to press charges." The townspeople murmured their approval. Their vague dislike now had a name: justice. They stared at Evelyn with open hostility. She was no longer one of them, not even a pitiable stray. She was a criminal, and Caleb Hart, the silent freighter who had defended her, was her accomplice. The sheriff looked at Evelyn, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Miss Grant, I'm afraid you will have to come with me." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Evelyn. She looked at the faces around her, a ring of accusers. She saw no mercy, no doubt, only the grim satisfaction of a mystery solved. They wanted her to be guilty. She looked at the small, crude jailhouse, a cage of sun-baked brick and iron bars. The thought of being locked in there, of being sent back east in shame to face a trial for a crime she did not commit, was more terrifying than starvation. Her eyes met Caleb's. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command to stay put. But she knew he could not fight the whole town, could not fight a sworn statement and a determined liar. In that split second, she made a decision. She would not be caged. With a cry that was half fear, half defiance, she turned and ran. She did not run toward the town. She ran the other way, past the end of the platform, past the water tower, out into the open desert. The sun was a hammer, the heat a suffocating blanket. The shouts behind her were faint, distorted by the vast, empty space. She ran blindly, her only thought to put distance between herself and the cage. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she pushed on, fueled by adrenaline and terror. The red dust kicked up by her feet coated her dress, her face, her very soul. Caleb did not hesitate. While the sheriff and the others were still processing her sudden flight, he was already moving. He vaulted onto his wagon, grabbing the reins. "Hia!" he roared, slapping the leather against the backs of his mules. The heavy wagon lurched into motion. not toward the road, but cutting across the rough, open ground, a cloud of dust billowing behind it. He kept his eyes fixed on the small, desperate figure of Evelyn, a speck of blue against the endless brown. He was gaining on her when he saw the other cloud of dust. Off to the west. It was moving fast, too fast for a farm wagon. It resolved into a shape he knew all too well, a mud wagon. A smaller, faster version of a stagecoach, being driven hard. And behind it, 3 riders, low in their saddles, closing the distance. Robbers. They were running from a hit, taking the back routes to avoid patrols. And Evelyn was running directly into their path. "Evelyn," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Stop!" She either did not hear him or was too panicked to listen. The riders saw her now, an unexpected obstacle. They would not stop. She was a complication to be run down and left behind. The lead rider spurred his horse, drawing a pistol. There was no time to think. Caleb cracked the reins, turning his team hard. The heavy freight wagon groaned, its wheels screaming as he aimed it not at Evelyn, but at the path of the oncoming coach. It was a desperate, foolish gamble. He was trying to cut them off, to create a barrier. The driver of the mud wagon saw him, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to swerve, but it was too late. The corner of Caleb's heavy wagon slammed into the front axle of the lighter coach. The sound was a horrific crunch of splintering wood and screaming horses. The mud wagon tipped, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air before it crashed onto its side, sending its occupants and a cascade of wooden debris skidding across the hard pan. The riders behind it reined in their horses violently, the animals rearing and whinnying in a chaotic tangle of hooves and dust. One of the riders' horses went down, throwing its master. The force of the impact threw Caleb sideways. He managed to hang on to the reins, but a long, jagged piece of wood from the shattered coach flew through the air like a spear, catching him high on the shoulder. It tore through his shirt and flesh, a white, hot line of agony. He ignored it, wrestling his terrified mules to a stop. The remaining 2 robbers, seeing their escape ruined and their companion injured, did not stay to fight. They fired a few wild, angry shots into the air and then spurred their horses, vanishing back into the desert from which they came. The world fell silent again, save for the panting of the mules and the low groans of the men in the wreckage. Evelyn had fallen to her knees, staring at the carnage, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Caleb leaped from the wagon, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood already soaking the sleeve of his shirt. He ran to her, his face pale beneath its layer of dust. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. She could only shake her head, her eyes wide with shock and fixed on the dark, spreading stain on his shoulder. You are bleeding." "It is nothing," he lied, grabbing her hand. "We have to go, before Thompson and his posse get here." He pulled her to her feet and led her away from the wreckage, into a series of low, rocky hills that offered the only cover in the stark landscape. He found what he was looking for a mile later, a shallow cave, a hollowed-out space in the side of a sandstone bluff, hidden by a cluster of stubborn, thorny bushes. It was not much, but it was out of the sun and out of sight. They collapsed inside, the cool, dark air a welcome relief. Evelyn's shock was finally giving way to a sickening dread. She looked at his shoulder, at the torn and bloody fabric. "We have to stop the bleeding." He leaned against the rock wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face tight with pain. "In the right pocket of my saddlebag, there is a flask." She scrambled to the wagon, which he had managed to guide near the rocks, and retrieved the bag. Her hands were shaking as she found the flask of whiskey and a small roll of clean cloth he kept for emergencies. Back in the cave, she gently tore his shirt away from the wound. It was a deep, ugly gash, oozing blood, the edges ragged and filled with grit. "This will sting," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She uncorked the flask and poured a little of the whiskey directly into the wound. He hissed, his body going rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee, but he did not cry out. She then took the cloth and began to clean the wound as gently as she could, her touch light and focused. The world had shrunk to this small, vital task, to the space of a few inches between her hands and his torn flesh. She was no longer a victim or a fugitive. She was a healer. He was no longer a stoic protector. He was a man, wounded and vulnerable. The air in the cave was thick with the scent of blood, whiskey, and dust. He watched her face, bent in concentration, her brow furrowed, a strand of hair clinging to her damp temple. He saw not pity in her expression, but a fierce, tender competence. The fire he so feared was not burning him. It was warming him. When the wound was clean, she tore another strip of cloth and began to bandaging it tightly, her movements sure and practiced. As she worked, her cheek brushed against his uninjured shoulder. He drew a sharp breath. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and hoarse. She finished tying the knot and looked up, her face only inches from his. "What is it?" He looked into her eyes, and the walls he had spent years building finally crumbled into dust. The fear was still there, a cold shadow in the back of his mind, but it was overshadowed by a feeling so powerful, so undeniable, that it stole his breath. "That ticket," he began, his voice barely audible. "The one to Wyoming." He paused, gathering his strength. "If I were buying a ticket, I would only want to go with you." His eyes held hers, and in them she saw the truth of his battered, lonely soul. He finished in a whisper that was the most profound declaration she had ever heard. "To forever." The words settled in the small, silent space between them. They were more than a confession. They were an offering, a promise of a destination that was not a place on a map, but a place beside him. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a deep, aching recognition. She had been waiting, not for a fiancé, not for a train, but for this, for a man who saw her, not as a prize or a burden, but as a partner on a journey. He slowly lifted his good hand, the right one, and reached for hers. His calloused fingers trembled as they closed over her smaller, work-roughened ones. The touch was electric, a current of shared pain, shared hope, shared solitude. It was a touch more intimate than any embrace, more honest than any vow. In that moment, words were useless things. Leaning forward, she closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, certain kiss, free of desperation or demand. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and whiskey, of gratitude and solace. It was a silent answer to a question he had not even realized he was asking. It was the purchase of a ticket for two. They spent the night in the shallow cave, a space that offered concealment but little comfort. Caleb's shoulder throbbed with a deep, insistent pain, a rhythm that matched the anxious beating of his own heart. He sat awake long after Evelyn's exhausted breathing had settled into the slow, even cadence of sleep, his mind a battlefield. Charles Worthington's smirking, confident face was burned into his memory. The man was a snake, and Caleb knew that snakes did not simply give up and crawl away when their prey escaped. He would have the whole town, and the law, on his side. Hiding in the hills was a temporary solution, a reprieve measured in hours, not days. Before the sun had fully risen, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gray, Caleb made a decision. He gently extricated himself from the blanket he had shared with Evelyn for warmth, his movements slow and careful to not wake her or jar his injured shoulder. He needed to know what was happening in Dry Creek. He needed to understand the enemy. He left a small canteen of water and a piece of jerky for her, then took his horse, leaving the wagon and mules hidden amongst the rocks. "I am going to scout," he had written in the sand with a stick, knowing she would worry. "Do not leave the cave." He rode in a wide, cautious circle, approaching the town from the south, keeping to the low ground. He tethered his horse in a dry wash and crept the last half-mile on foot. from a small rise. He had a clear view of the main street. What he saw confirmed his fears. Charles had wasted no time. He was standing on the steps of the hotel, speaking with Sheriff Thompson and a handful of other men. He was not behaving like a man who had been wronged, but like a man taking charge, directing the formation of a posse. His confidence was absolute. Caleb slipped away, his mind racing. He could not fight a posse, and Evelyn could not keep running forever. There had to be another way, a truth stronger than Charles's lie. He worked his way around to the back of the town, moving through the alley behind the saloon. He was hoping to overhear something, anything that might give him an advantage. The saloon's back door was propped open to catch the morning's meager breeze, and from within he could hear the clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation. Then he saw it. Tacked to a message board just inside the open door was a collection of notices, an advertisement for a blacksmith, a reward for a lost bull, and a sheet of paper that made his blood run cold. It was a wanted poster, the ink still fresh, the sketch crudely but unmistakably the face of Charles Worthington. The name was different. Charles Wright. But the crime was clear wanted in the Arizona territory for land fraud and issuing false deeds. The reward was $100. Suddenly, everything made sense. The $500 was not a fiction invented on the spot. It was likely the proceedings from his latest swindle. He had accused Evelyn of his own crime, creating a perfect distraction and painting himself as the victim to avoid any suspicion while he passed through. Dry Creek was not his destination. It was just a temporary stage for his act. Caleb backed away into the shadows, his mind working furiously. Sheriff Thompson was clearly in Worthington's pocket, or at the very least, too lazy and easily influenced to question a well-dressed man with a plausible story. Going to him with this information would be useless. Charles would simply deny it, claim it was a case of mistaken identity, and use his influence to have the poster torn down. He needed an honest lawman. He thought of Sheriff Brody in Silver Canyon, a town 50 miles west. Brody was a hard but fair man, not one to be swayed by a fancy suit or a full purse. But getting a message to him was the problem. The telegraph lines ran through the station now controlled by Charles's narrative. Caleb retreated to his wagon, his shoulders screaming in protest. He found a small, leather-bound ledger he used for his freight accounts, a stub of a pencil, and a spare envelope, hiding behind the wagon. He wrote a quick, urgent letter to Sheriff Brody. He described Charles Worthington, alias Wright, the wanted poster, and the false accusation against Evelyn Grant. He explained that they were in hiding and that the local sheriff was compromised. He urged Brody to come to Dry Creek with a federal warrant if possible, and to come quietly. He signed it simply. A friend of the law. Now, to send it. He scanned the horizon. A lone rider, perhaps a prospector or a circuit preacher, was making his way west on the main trail, still a mile or so distant. It was a risk, but it was the only one he had. Caleb mounted his horse and rode to intercept him, cutting a path through the brush to meet the trail well ahead of the rider. He met the man, a grizzled old prospector with kind eyes, and explained that he had an urgent message for a family member in Silver Canyon and could not deliver it himself. He pressed a silver dollar into the man's hand along with the letter, a payment that ensured the message would not be forgotten or discarded. The prospector tipped his hat, tucked the letter into his saddlebag, and continued on his way, oblivious to the life and death importance of his delivery. Caleb watched him until he was a small dot against the horizon, then turned back toward the cave, the first part of his desperate plan complete. When he returned, he found Evelyn pacing the small space in front of the cave, her face a mask of anxiety. She rushed to him as he dismounted, her eyes immediately going to the fresh blood stain that had seeped through his bandage. "You are hurt again," she breathed, her voice filled with guilt. "This is my fault, all of it." "It is not your fault," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "And the wound is fine." "Fine," she cried, her control finally snapping. "Nothing about this is fine. Caleb, you were shot at. You have a posse looking for you, all because of me. I am a curse. I bring ruin to anyone who tries to help me." He saw the old fear in her eyes, the deeply ingrained belief that she was a burden, a thing to be abandoned. She turned away from him, her back rigid. "I am leaving," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Tonight, I will go east. They are looking for me to the west. I will draw them away from you. You can go back to your life." He reached out with his good hand and caught her arm, turning her to face him. Her face was wet with tears she was too proud to let him see fall. "There is no life to go back to without you," he said, his voice low and intense. "And we are not running. Not anymore." He saw the confusion and fear in her eyes and knew he had to tell her everything. "His name is not Worthington. It is right. He is a wanted man, a liar and a swindler. He accused you to hide himself." Her jaw dropped, her mind struggling to absorb the information, but then the fear returned, stronger than ever. "Then he is even more dangerous. He will not let us expose him. He will kill us." "Caleb." "He will not get the chance," Caleb said, his grip on her arm firm but gentle. He looked directly into her eyes, willing her to hear him, to believe him. "Evelyn, listen to me. All your life, people have told you who you are. A burden, a woman not luxurious enough, a thief. They have all been lies, and you have been silent. We have both been silent for too long." He took a breath, and his next words were a vow. "No one deserves to be silenced for a lifetime for fear of what others might say. This is not just about clearing your name. It is about claiming it." His words struck a chord deep inside her, touching the core of her 40 days of silent suffering. He was right. Her silence had been a cage of her own making. She looked at him, at the fierce conviction in his tired eyes, and for the first time she felt a flicker not of fear, but of fight. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden, dramatic shift in the weather. The sky, which had been a clear, merciless blue, began to darken in the west, the clouds piling up in bruised shades of purple and gray. The wind picked up, howling through the rocks with a mournful, rising pitch. A storm was coming, a monster of a storm. The exposed cave would not offer enough protection. "We have to move," Caleb said, his eyes on the churning sky. "Back to the warehouse. It is the only solid shelter for miles." They managed to get the wagon and the team moving just as the first drops of rain, fat and heavy as coins, began to fall. By the time they reached the relative safety of the abandoned freight depot, the storm had broken in all its fury. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it shook the very foundations of the old building. And then came a flash of lightning so brilliant it bleached the world white for a second, followed by an instantaneous, deafening explosion of thunder. They both smelled it at the same time, the sharp, acrid scent of burning wood. Caleb wrenched the great door open a crack. Through the deluge, he could see it. The lightning had struck the telegraph pole next to the station. The pole had splintered, and the hot wires had fallen onto the wooden roof of the building. The station, its wood dried to tinder by years of desert sun, was already engulfed in flames. The wind, which should have been doused by the rain, was instead fanning the fire, whipping it into a raging, uncontrollable inferno. Shouts of alarm rose from the town, barely audible over the roar of the storm and the fire. Figures ran through the rain, their forms illuminated in the ghastly orange light. The fire was a living, breathing creature, consuming the heart of the small town. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his face a mask of horror. The sight of the roaring flames, the sound of the cracking, collapsing timbers. It was all too familiar. He was no longer in Dry Creek. He was standing outside his ranch house, helpless, listening to the screams of his wife as the roof fell in. The smell of burning pine filled his nostrils. The heat was a physical presence, stealing the air from his lungs. He could not move. He was trapped in the amber of his worst memory. Caleb Evelyn's voice was a sharp cry, pulling at him, but he could not hear her. He could only hear Eleanor. Then, through the chaos, a new sound emerged, a human cry for help, a window in the station office, which had not yet been consumed, shattered outward. Station Master Abernathy's face appeared, black with soot, his mouth open in a desperate, silent scream. He had gone back for the cash box, for his ledgers, and now he was trapped. The sight of that living, terrified face broke the spell of the past. This was not a memory. This was happening now. This was a life he could save. Before Evelyn could even guess his intention, he was moving. He plunged out of the warehouse, into the storm, running directly toward the burning building. "No," Evelyn screamed, her voice lost in the din. She watched in disbelief as he disappeared into the smoke and flames through the office door. A moment later, a massive support beam on the porch gave way with a groan, and the roof above the entrance began to sag ominously. He was going to die. He was going to let the ghost of one fire claim him in another. The thought was unacceptable. She would not lose him. She ran out after him, the heat and smoke a physical blow. She reached the collapsing porch just as he emerged from the inferno, half carrying, half dragging the choking, weeping form of Abernathy. Caleb pushed the station master to safety, but then he stopped, turning to look back at the fire. His face illuminated, his expression lost and distant. He was staring into the heart of his own personal hell. Just then, the rest of the porch roof gave way, crashing down in a shower of sparks and flaming debris, cutting him off. He was standing on an island of fire, mesmerized. Evelyn did not hesitate. She scrambled over the hot, smoldering wreckage, ignoring the pain as embers burned through her dress and seared her skin. She reached him, grabbing his arm with both hands. It was like touching a statue. "Caleb!" she shouted, her voice raw. He did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the flames. She got in front of him, cupping his face in her hands, forcing his gaze away from the fire and onto her. His eyes were vacant, seeing things she could not. "Caleb, look at me," she commanded, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "Look at me. You are here with me." Her words, her touch, finally broke through the haunted darkness. His eyes focused on her face, and he blinked, as if waking from a long and terrible dream. He saw the rain and soot on her cheeks, the fierce love in her eyes. She pulled him back over the debris, away from the heat, away from the past. "You are not in the past anymore," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her words a promise and a prayer. They stood together in the rain, watching the station burn, holding each other up. As the storm began to subside and the first faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the fire was reduced to a blackened, smoldering skeleton. The town was in chaos, but no one noticed the two figures by the old warehouse. They had faced the fire, both real and remembered, and they had survived. Caleb looked from the ruins to Evelyn's face, illuminated in the soft light of the new day. The past had been burned away. There was nothing left for them in Dry Creek. He wordlessly helped her onto the seat of his wagon. Without a backward glance, they rode west, leaving the smoke and the ashes behind them, driving directly into the rising sun. They rode for 2 days, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the smoking ruins of Dry Creek. They spoke little, the shared trauma of the fire and the escape creating a bond that needed no words. Caleb's shoulder was a constant, burning agony, but he never complained, his focus solely on the road ahead. Evelyn tended to his wound with a quiet efficiency, her touch gentle but firm, in the silence of the trail. A new dynamic was forged. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were partners, equals in a desperate flight toward an unknown future. They came upon Red Hollow at dusk on the second day. It was nestled in a small, sheltered valley. a surprising splash of green after the relentless brown of the desert. A creek, lined with cottonwood trees, ran through the center of the town, and the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke instead of dust. It felt like a place where things could grow. Their arrival was quiet. They found the town's only inn, a 2-story wooden building with a wide, welcoming porch called the Traveler's Rest. The proprietor, a stout, weary woman named Martha, looked them over with a practiced, non-judgmental eye. She saw a wounded man and a woman who looked like she had been dragged through hell backward. She did not ask questions. It was not her business. She took their last few coins in exchange for a room for the night and the promise of work to cover their keep. The next morning, the work began. Caleb, his arm in a sling Evelyn had fashioned from a torn shirt, could not do heavy labor, so he chopped vegetables in the kitchen. His movements with his one good hand slow but precise. Evelyn scrubbed floors, changed linens, and served meals in the small dining room. They worked from sunrise to long after sunset. The physical exhaustion a welcome anesthetic for their troubled minds. On their 3rd evening in Red Hollow, as they sat in the kitchen sharing a bowl of leftover stew, Martha's husband, a kind, balding man named Henry, was looking over the inn's register. "And what is the family name?" he asked, his pen poised over the book. "For the accounts." Evelyn and Caleb exchanged a look. Grant was the name of a wanted woman. Hart was the name of her supposed accomplice. They were ghosts, with no names that belonged to them anymore. Evelyn spoke before Caleb could, her voice clear and steady. "The name is Hart," she said. She looked at Henry, then at Caleb, a quiet declaration passing between them. "Eva Hart, and my husband, Caleb." The name felt strange and new on her tongue, yet also deeply right. It was not a disguise. It was a choice. She was no longer Evelyn Grant, the woman who waited. She was Eva Hart, a woman who worked, who fought, who had claimed a future for herself. Caleb looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a profound, unspoken emotion. He had offered her a ticket to forever, and she had just signed her name to it. He simply nodded at Henry, sealing the fact. They lived in a small room at the back of the inn, their lives falling into a simple, quiet rhythm. As Caleb's shoulder healed, he began to look for work that suited him better than dicing carrots. He found a blacksmith shop with a forge that was rarely used. He was a skilled farrier, his hands possessing a deep, intuitive knowledge of horses and hot iron. He struck a deal with the blacksmith, renting the space to shoe horses and mend tools. The ringing of his hammer on the anvil became a new, steady heartbeat in the town, a sound of creation and repair. Eva continued to work at the inn, her quiet competence and gentle demeanor slowly winning over Martha and Henry. But news, like water, always find a way to trickle downhill. Whispers eventually arrived from Dry Creek, carried by freighters and travelers. The story twisted and embellished with each retelling. They heard the rumors in snippets and sideways glances. He was a killer, they said, a brawler who had murdered a man over a woman. She was a thief, a seductress who had stolen a fortune from a wealthy gentleman and run off with her violent lover. The labels, the abandoned woman and the killer, followed them like shadows. Some townsfolk were wary, crossing the street to avoid them. But Red Hollow was a place of second chances, populated by people who had their own reasons for starting over. Their hard work and quiet dignity spoke louder than the gossip. People saw Caleb's skill with their horses, the gentle way he treated the animals. They saw Eva's tireless work at the inn, the kindness she showed to weary travelers. One afternoon, a group of children gathered near Caleb's forge, drawn by the fire and the rhythmic clang of the hammer. They watched him, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. During a break, while a horseshoe was cooling, he sat down on an anvil and, to their astonishment, pulled out his harmonica. He played a simple, lively tune, a song about a fox chasing a goose. The music was bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to his usual silent demeanor. One of the boys, bolder than the rest, asked if he could teach them. From that day on, Caleb's Forge became an unofficial school of music in the afternoons. The sound of a lone, haunting harmonica was joined by the wheezing, enthusiastic attempts of a half-dozen children. He was letting the world back in, one hesitant note at a time. Their life was small, but it was theirs. They had a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and a fragile, growing peace. They had each other. The ghosts of Dry Creek began to recede, the memories of the fire and the chase losing their sharp edges. For the first time, the future did not seem like a threat, but a quiet, open space they could fill together. This peace was shattered on a Tuesday. A well-dressed man, a geologist by his own account, was staying at the inn, his voice booming through the dining room as he held court, speaking of a new silver strike he had found in the nearby hills. He was selling shares in a new mine, the Red Hollow Bonanza, promising untold riches to anyone who invested. Ava was clearing plates from a nearby table when she heard his laugh, a familiar, confident sound that made a cold dread snake up her spine. She looked over, and her heart stopped. The geologist was older, with a new beard and spectacles, but there was no mistaking him. It was Charles Worthington, or Charles Wright. He was here, in her sanctuary, spinning a new web of lies. She backed away into the kitchen, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the plates. She leaned against the wall, gasping for air. He was alive. He was free. And he was here, perpetrating the same kind of fraud that had almost destroyed her. All the fear, all the humiliation, came rushing back. That night, she told Caleb, they sat in their small room, the single candle flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He listened without interrupting, his face growing harder and colder with every word she spoke. When she was finished, he stood up and began to pace the small room. "We will leave in the morning," he said, his voice flat and final. "We can be in Oregon by the end of the month. He will never find us there." Eva looked at him, at the man who had faced down a fire to save another, who now wanted to run from a different kind of monster. "Leave," she whispered, "and let him do this to these people, to the blacksmith who rented you his forge, to Martha and Henry, who gave us a home when we had nothing. He is going to rob them blind, Caleb, just like he was going to rob me of my future." "It is not our fight," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Our fight is to stay alive, to stay free. I will not risk you. I will not risk this." He gestured around the small, bare room, but he meant the life they had built, the peace they had found. He remembered the fire that had taken Eleanor, the consequence of standing his ground against outlaws who wanted his land. He had learned the hard way that sometimes survival was the only victory that mattered. But Eva had learned a different lesson. She stood up to face him, her small frame filled with a new, unshakable strength. "And what kind of freedom is it if we have to buy it with our silence?" she asked, her voice ringing with a conviction that stunned him. "What kind of life is it if we have to run every time we see a shadow? He silenced me in Dry Creek, with his lies and his money. I will not let him silence me again." She took a step closer, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "You are the one who told me that no one deserves to be silenced for a lifetime. Did you mean it? Or was that just something to say to a frightened woman in a cave?" Her words hit him harder than any fist. He stopped pacing and looked at her, truly seeing the woman she had become. She was not the fragile girl from the station. She was not even the determined worker from the freight platform. This was a woman of substance, of principle, a woman who was willing to risk her own safety for what was right. A profound and painful realization washed over him. Love was not just about protecting someone from harm. It was not a fortress with high walls. True love was about honoring the strength and courage of the person you cherished. It was about standing with them, even when the ground beneath them was shaking. To ask her to run would be to ask her to be less than who she was. It would be to diminish the very spirit he had come to love. "If I go to the sheriff here," she said, her voice softer now, "if I testify against him, they will find out who I am. They might still arrest me. I might lose everything. But it is a risk I have to take. I cannot live in a world where men like him win just because people like us are too afraid to speak. Caleb walked to her, his face a mask of inner conflict. He put his hands on her shoulders, his good hand and the one that still ached from the wound she had healed. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the battle he was fighting within himself, the battle between his fear of losing her and his admiration for her courage. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "When do we go to the sheriff?" he asked. The simple question was a capitulation, a declaration of allegiance, and the most profound expression of love he had ever uttered. He was not just standing by her. He was standing with her. He understood. The only way to forever was not to run from the world, but to face it, together. The courthouse in Silver Junction was not a grand hall of justice, but a large, hastily constructed wooden building that smelled of raw pine, stale tobacco, and the collective anxiety of everyone packed inside. The benches were crowded with miners, ranchers, and townsfolk from both Silver Junction and Red Hollow, all drawn by the promise of a trial that had become the biggest spectacle of the season. Sunlight streamed through the tall, dirty windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes and the tense faces of the spectators. Eva sat beside her lawyer, a young, earnest man named Mr. Finch, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She had insisted on wearing her simple work dress from the inn, a quiet statement that she was not the woman of fine things Charles had described. Across the room, Charles Worthington sat beside his own lawyer, a portly, silver-tongued man from back east named Silas Croft. Charles looked perfectly at ease, his suit immaculate, his expression one of patient condescension, as if this whole affair were a tiresome but necessary formality. Caleb sat in the front row, directly behind Eva. He was a pillar of stillness in the restless room. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes never left Charles, a silent, burning intensity in his gaze. Sheriff Brody of Silver Junction, the man Caleb had summoned with his desperate letter, stood guard near the judge's bench, his presence a guarantee that this trial would not be the farce Charles had orchestrated in Dry Creek. The proceedings began, and Charles was called as the first witness. He walked to the stand with a confident stride, laid his hand on the Bible, and swore his oath with a sincerity that made Eva's stomach turn under his lawyer's gentle questioning. He painted a masterful picture of betrayal. He spoke of his deep affection for his fiancée, Evelyn Grant, and his ambitious plans for their life together. "I entrusted her with $500, Charles said, his voice resonating with sorrowful gravitas, a sum meant to secure our passage and establish our new home in Wyoming. I thought I could trust her with my future. Instead, she vanished, leaving me with a broken heart and an empty bank account." Then he turned his attention to Eva, his eyes full of feigned pity. "I see now that I was not her only confidant. It is clear she had a partner in her deception all along. A violent man," he added, glancing pointedly at Caleb, who was no doubt promised a share of the profits. He then detailed his new enterprise, the Red Hollow Bonanza Mine, claiming it was his attempt to rebuild his shattered finances. "But even here," he concluded with a sigh, "my past has followed me. This woman and her accomplice have sought to ruin me once more with slander, simply because I asked for my own money back." The story was a masterpiece of lies, built on a foundation of Eva's known history. The crowd murmured, their sympathies clearly swaying toward the well-spoken, respectable victim on the stand. When it was Mr. Finch's turn to cross-examine, Charles deflected every question with practiced ease, turning the narrative back to his own version of events, painting Eva as a cunning and manipulative criminal. Then, Eva was called to the stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked to the witness box, the dozens of pairs of eyes on her feeling like a physical weight. She told her story in a low, clear voice, speaking of the 40 days on the platform, of Charles's letter of dismissal, of the life she had tried to build for herself. Silas Croft, Charles's lawyer, rose for his cross-examination. He approached her like a wolf circling its prey. "Miss Grant, Or should I say, Mrs. Hart, he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It is so difficult to keep track. You claim Mr. Worthington abandoned you, yet you admit to taking on a new name, a new husband, with remarkable speed. Does that sound like the behavior of a grieving fiancé? I took a new name to start a new life, Eva said, her voice trembling slightly. To be free of the past. Or was it to hide from it? Croft shot back. To hide from your crime. You worked at the train station. You saw the freight manifests. You knew Mr. Hart was a man of some means, a man with a wagon full of goods. Did you see him as your next opportunity? Was he your escape plan after you stole Mr. Worthington's money? No, that is not true. Is it not you fled from the law in Dry Creek? You were involved in a violent altercation with a passenger coach, and now you appear here, trying to destroy Mr. Worthington's new business venture. It seems you have a pattern of deception and chaos. Tell me, Mrs. Hart, did your new husband help you spend the $500? The questions were relentless, twisting every truth into a lie. Eva felt her composure cracking, tears of frustration and helplessness welling in her eyes. She looked out at the sea of faces and saw only suspicion and condemnation. She looked at Caleb, and his steady, unwavering gaze was the only thing that kept her from breaking down completely. Finally, Mr. Finch called his last witness. The defense calls Caleb Hart to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as Caleb rose and walked to the box. His presence was a stark contrast to Charles's polished sophistication. He was a man of the West, solid and unyielding as the mountains. He took the oath, his voice a low rumble. Mr. Finch began. Mr. Hart, you have heard the accusations made by Mr. Worthington. What do you have to say in response? He is a liar, Caleb said simply, the words carrying more weight than a dozen eloquent speeches. And a thief. Silas Croft leaped to his feet. Objection, the witness is making baseless accusations. Sustained, the judge said wearily. Mr. Hart, you will confine your answers to the facts. That is a fact, Caleb replied, his eyes fixed on Charles. He then turned his attention to the judge. Your Honor, Charles Worthington is not his real name. He is a swindler known in the Arizona Territory as Charles Wright. There is a warrant for his arrest for land fraud. Another wave of murmurs swept the room. Charles's face paled slightly, but he quickly composed himself, whispering furiously to his lawyer. Croft was on his feet again. This is an outrage, an unsubstantiated, desperate lie from a desperate man. Where is your proof? Caleb reached into the inner pocket of his coat. I have proof. He pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled letter and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. I retrieved this from Mr. Wright's hotel room here in Silver Junction. He grew careless, believing no one in this town was smart enough to be suspicious of him. The judge unfolded the letter and began to read, his eyebrows rising with every line. Charles was now visibly sweating, his confident facade beginning to crack. This letter, the judge said, his voice grave, is addressed to a Mr. Silas Croft. He looked pointedly at the sweating lawyer. It appears to be a draft of a confession, a legal strategy. Perhaps it details a scheme to sell fraudulent deeds to a non-existent silver mine. It outlines a plan to collect the investment money and disappear, and it mentions a previous, similar success in Arizona. The courtroom erupted. Silas Croft's face had turned the color of old parchment. Charles Worthington, or Wright, looked like a trapped animal. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that was no longer there. His reputation was ruined. His freedom was gone. His world was collapsing in on him. This is a forgery, he screamed, jumping to his feet. A plant! They are trying to frame me! Sheriff Brody took a step toward him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. That will be enough. Right, sit down. But Charles was beyond reason. His carefully constructed world had been demolished by a silent freighter and a woman he had dismissed as worthless. in one fluid, desperate motion. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, silver derringer. A woman in the crowd screamed. Everything happened in a blur. Charles did not aim at the sheriff. He aimed at the source of his ruin. He aimed at Eva. Caleb moved without thinking. It was pure instinct, a primal need to put his body between her and the threat. He shoved her backward, off the witness stand. Just as the derringer fired, the sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Caleb's right shoulder, the same shoulder that had been torn open by the wreckage of the coach. The impact spun him around, and he staggered, his hand flying to the wound, his face a mask of shock and agony. Blood, dark and shockingly red, gushed between his fingers. Eva scrambled up from the floor, her mind reeling. She saw Caleb, staggering, bleeding. She saw Charles, his face contorted in a mask of crazed fury, raising the pistol for a second shot. And she saw Sheriff Brody, who had lunged for Charles, lose his footing, his own holstered pistol tumbling to the floor and skidding to a stop just inches from her feet. In that moment, 40 days of silent endurance and months of hard-won strength coalesced into a single, decisive action. She did not scream. She did not cower. She lunged forward and snatched the sheriff's heavy Colt revolver from the floor. Her hands, surprisingly steady, closed around the grip. She raised the weapon with both hands, the long barrel wavering only slightly, and pointed it directly at Charles's chest. The room was utterly silent, save for Caleb's ragged breathing. Charles froze, his own small pistol looking like a toy compared to the weapon now aimed at his heart. He saw in her eyes not the frightened, abandoned girl he had left on a station platform, but a woman made of iron and fire. He saw his own end. Eva held his gaze, the full weight of her journey culminating in this single, breathtaking moment. She had the power to end him, to exact her revenge, to answer his violence with violence. But as she looked at him, she saw not a monster, but a small, pathetic man, a coward whose only power was in his lies. And she knew that killing him would not free her. It would only bind her to him forever. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a shout, but a low, clear pronouncement that cut through the silence like a razor. "You left me at that station for 40 days. Charles," she said, her voice steady and sure. "You thought you had left me with nothing, but today I bought my own ticket." With those words, she lowered the gun. She had claimed her own justice, not with a bullet, but with the truth. The spell was broken. Sheriff Brody and his deputies swarmed over Charles, wrenching the derringer from his grasp and forcing him to the floor in a heap. The crowd, released from its shocked silence, erupted into a roar of cheers and shouts. But Eva did not hear them. She dropped the heavy pistol and rushed to Caleb's side, catching him as his knees began to buckle. She eased him onto a bench, her hands pressing against his bleeding shoulder, her tears finally falling, hot and fast, mingling with his blood. "Caleb," she sobbed, her voice thick with love and terror. He looked up at her, his face pale with pain, but his eyes were clear and full of a fierce, burning pride. He reached up with his good hand and cupped her cheek. Amid the chaos of the cheering crowd and the arrest of the man who had haunted them, they found their own small, quiet center. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his, a silent vow passing between them. They had faced the fire and the lies and the guns, and they were still standing, together. The bullet had torn through the same flesh, but it had not broken the same man. The first wound, from the jagged wood of the shattered coach, had been an injury to his body. This one, taken for her, felt different. It was a wound of purpose, and in some strange way, it began to heal the older, deeper injuries to his soul. They returned to Red Hollow not as fugitives, but as heroes. The story of the trial, of Eva's courage and Caleb's sacrifice, had traveled faster than they did. When their wagon rolled down the main street, people came out of the shops and houses. not to stare with suspicion, but to tip their hats and offer quiet, respectful nods. Martha and Henry from the Traveler's Rest met them with tears in their eyes and insisted they leave the small, cramped room at the inn. The town had taken up a collection, a gesture of gratitude for saving them from Charles Wright's swindle, and had rented them a small house on the edge of town. Its whitewashed walls nestled under the shade of a large cottonwood tree. It was in this small house that Caleb began to recover. The town's doctor, a stern but capable man named Elias Croft, had removed the bullet and stitched the wound, declaring that Caleb was lucky the shot had gone clean through without hitting bone. The days that followed were a blur of pain, fever, and laudanum. But through it all, Ava was a constant, steady presence. She changed his bandages, bathed his brow with cool water, and fed him broth when he could not stomach anything else. She moved about the small rooms with a quiet grace, her presence a balm to his restless spirit. In the long hours of his convalescence, he watched her. He watched the way she swept the porch in the morning, her movements efficient and sure. He watched the way the sunlight caught in her hair as she sat by the window, mending his torn shirt. He watched her talk to the neighbors who came by with offerings of bread and stew, her voice now confident and clear. He was seeing the woman she had become, and he felt a love so profound it was a physical ache in his chest, almost as strong as the pain in his shoulder. One afternoon, when the fever had broken and his mind was clear for the first time in a week, she was sitting in a chair beside his bed, a small, leather-bound journal and a pencil in her hands. She had been writing, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What is that?" he asked, his voice raspy. She started, looking up with a blush on her cheeks. "It is nothing. Just thoughts." "Read it to me." He said it was not a command, but a quiet request. She hesitated, her shyness a fleeting glimpse of the woman she had once been. Then she took a breath and opened the journal. Her voice was soft, hesitant at first, then gaining strength as she read. She did not call it a poem, but it was one, its rhythm simple and true as a heartbeat. She spoke of a woman made of dust, waiting by tracks of steel for a ghost that never came. She spoke of a silence so deep it had a sound of its own. Then she spoke of a man with a scar, a man who offered bread without a price and shelter in a storm. She spoke of a fire, of a courtroom, and of a voice, long silent, that finally learned to speak its own name. The final lines were a whisper that filled the small, quiet room. He did not promise a palace, nor a gown of silk and lace. He offered just a ticket to an undiscovered place, not a town upon a map, nor a destination known, but a place called forever, a place that we could own. He bought a simple ticket, with a look and with a touch. I never knew that paper could ever mean so much. When she finished, she could not look at him. She closed the book, her heart pounding. The silence stretched on, and she began to fear she had exposed too much, that she had been foolish. He reached out his good hand and laid it over hers, his fingers warm and strong. She looked up and saw that his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I never knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that a man could be so found." As Caleb's strength returned, their life in Red Hollow took on a new shape. Ava, emboldened by her own journey, saw a need in the town. There were a handful of children, orphans from a mining accident years before, who ran wild, without family or schooling. They were the same children who had been drawn to Caleb's harmonica, remembering his words that no one should be silenced. She decided to act. She went to the town council and asked for the use of the abandoned one-room schoolhouse at the edge of the creek. She started a small, informal class. At first, only 3 children showed up, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes wary. She did not just teach them their letters and numbers. She taught them to tell their own stories, to stand and speak their thoughts, to believe that their voices mattered. She told them, "Your story is your own. Do not ever let anyone else tell you what it is." Within a month, Her class had grown to 8 students, and the sound of children's laughter once again filled the old schoolhouse. While Eva was building a community, Caleb was rebuilding his own world. As soon as he was strong enough to swing a hammer, he began to work. He did not go back to the blacksmith shop, but instead began to clear a patch of land behind their small house. With lumber donated by grateful townspeople, he began to build. He was not just building a stable for his mules, he was building a foundation. He worked from dawn until dusk, the rhythmic thud of his hammer a testament to his returning strength. The act of creation, of taking raw wood and making something solid and useful, was a healing process. He was not just building a shelter for his animals, he was building a home. One day, Eva came home from her school to find him not at the half-finished stable, but on his knees in the small patch of earth in front of their house. He had a small sack beside him. He was carefully planting something along the porch railing. "What are you doing?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. He looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his good arm. "Putting down roots," he said. He reached into the sack and pulled out a small, thorny cane. "They are white roses. My mother always said every home needs a white rose bush. For peace." Eva's heart swelled. He was not a man of easy words or grand gestures, but this small act of planting a flower was more profound than any sonnet. He was planting a future that included not just shelter and work, but beauty and peace, a future with her. The seasons turned. The long, dry heat of summer gave way to the cool, crisp air of autumn. And then, one evening, the first rains of the season began to fall. It was not a violent storm like the one in Dry Creek, but a soft, steady shower that drummed a gentle rhythm on the new shingles of the stable roof. The smell of the rain on the thirsty earth was the scent of life itself. They had just finished their supper, and Eva was standing on the covered porch, watching the rain wash the dust from the world. The white rose bushes, now firmly rooted, glistened in the lantern light. Caleb came to stand beside her, his wounded shoulder now only a dull ache, a reminder of all they had overcome. He slipped his good arm around her waist, pulling her close. The only sound was the gentle patter of the rain. Without a word, he began to sway, a slow, simple rhythm. Eva leaned her head against his chest, and they began to dance. A quiet, shuffling two-step on the rough wooden planks of their porch. It was more intimate than any grand ballroom waltz. It was a dance of two souls who had found their harbor. He rested his cheek against the top of her head. "You know," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair, "train stations are not so scary anymore, when you know someone is waiting at the end of the line." She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the warm lantern light, her eyes shining. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, a smile that reached all the way to her soul. "That is because you bought me a ticket," she whispered, her voice full of a love that was as steady and as life-giving as the rain falling around them. "To forever." A year in Red Hollow passed like a peaceful dream after a long and troubled night. The seasons flowed one into the next, marked by the blooming of the white roses Caleb had planted, the swelling of the creek in the spring, and the golden turning of the cottonwood leaves in the fall. Eva's school became a cornerstone of the town, her quiet strength nurturing not just the minds of the children, but the spirit of the community. Caleb's forge was the town's steady heartbeat, his skill with iron and horses a thing of quiet legend. The names Eva and Caleb Hart were no longer whispered with suspicion, but spoken with a deep and abiding respect. They had found more than a sanctuary. They had found a home. The change came subtly at first. It was in the way Eva would pause in her work, a hand resting on her lower belly, a secret, knowing smile on her lips. It was in the new, fiercely protective light in Caleb's eyes whenever he looked at her. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the last of the sunset paint the valley in strokes of purple and gold, she took his large, calloused hand and placed it on her stomach. "I think," she said, her voice a soft whisper, that our family is going to need a little more room. He felt it then, a faint, fluttering movement beneath his palm, a tiny, insistent drumbeat of a new life. A feeling so overwhelming, so profound, washed over him that he could not speak. He simply looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and saw his entire future reflected there. The ghosts of the fire, of Eleanor, had long since faded, not replaced, but honored by the promise of this new beginning. Red Hollow had been their harbor, the place they had healed, but now they needed more than a harbor. They needed an ocean. They needed a place that was entirely their own, a piece of land to pass down to the child who was coming. They said their goodbyes to the town that had given them a second chance, promising to return, but knowing their path now lay elsewhere. They traveled west, toward the great saw-toothed peaks of the Sierra Nevada. They found what they were looking for in a high mountain valley, a piece of land with a meadow of rich, dark soil, a stand of tall pines for timber, and a creek that ran clear and cold all year round. In the distance, the snow-capped mountains stood like silent, eternal guardians. Below them, in the vast expanse of the plains, the twin steel lines of the railroad cut a path through the wilderness. They began to build. The work was hard, but it was a joyful labor. The sound of Caleb's axe biting into pine echoed through the valley, a clean, sharp sound of creation. Eva, her body growing rounder with the promise of new life, managed their camp, planned their garden, and walked the boundaries of their land each day, learning its rhythms and its secrets. One evening, as they sat by their campfire, watching the stars blaze to life in the clear mountain air, she looked down at the distant ribbon of track, where the light of a passing train was a tiny, moving star. "It is funny," she said, her voice thoughtful. "For so long, a train station was a place of endings for me, a place of being left behind." Caleb looked from the tracks to the foundation of the home they were building. "It is not a place of endings or beginnings," he said. "It is just a place to wait for the next part of the journey." He smiled, a slow, rare smile that transformed his rugged face. "We should call this place a station." "Our station?" Eva's eyes lit up. "Forever Station," she said, the name coming to her lips as if it had been waiting there all along. It was perfect. A few weeks later, as the walls of their cabin were beginning to rise, a lone rider approached their camp. It was an old prospector, his beard as white as the mountain snow, his eyes a startlingly bright blue. Caleb looked up from his work, his hand instinctively going to the axe that was never far from his side. Then a look of recognition dawned on his face. "Silas," he said, his voice full of disbelief. The old man grinned, a network of deep wrinkles spreading across his face. "Caleb Hart, I will be. Heard you had gone and gotten yourself civilized." It was Silas Croft, a man Caleb had known from his freighting days, a friend from his old life. They spent the evening by the fire, sharing stories, the years of separation melting away in the easy companionship of old friends. Silas had been down in the Arizona territory, and his talk was of new strikes and old claims. As the fire burned low, Silas's expression grew more somber. "Heard some news on my way up that might interest you," he said, his voice dropping. "Heard they stretched Charles Wright's neck down in Yuma 2 months back for the murder of a federal marshal during his escape." The name fell into the quiet night, and the world seemed to stop. Charles, dead, the final ghost from their past, the source of so much pain and fear, was gone. Eva, who had been listening from the cabin doorway, felt not a sense of triumph or revenge, but a profound, shuddering release, as if a great weight she had not even realized she was still carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. She unconsciously placed a hand on her belly, on the new life stirring within, a life that would never know the shadow of that man. Caleb said nothing, but he reached for her hand, his grip solid and reassuring. The last chapter of their old story was finally, truly, closed. After Silas had left the next morning, continuing on his endless search for gold, Caleb went to a small wooden chest where he kept his few personal possessions. He took something out, something he had been working on in the quiet moments of the evening. He came to Ava and held it out to her. It was a small, simple picture frame, crafted from a piece of smooth, golden pine left over from the cabin walls, and inside the frame, protected by a small piece of glass he had carefully cut, was a worn, faded piece of paper. It was the train ticket, the one to Wyoming, the one she had thrown away in the dust of the Dry Creek platform so long ago. "I thought," he said, his voice a low rumble, "that our home should have its founding document." Tears welled in her eyes as she took it from him. It was no longer a symbol of abandonment, a reminder of a broken promise. It was a testament to their beginning. It was the improbable, discarded thing that had sparked their entire journey. It was the first unwitting ticket to forever. She held it to her heart, the smooth wood warm against her skin. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the high peaks of the Sierras, they stood together on the rise of land where their front porch would one day be. They were not speaking, simply watching the sky set ablaze with color. Then, from the plains below, came a familiar, lonesome sound, the whistle of the westbound train. They watched it approach, a river of iron and steam flowing through the vast landscape. The wind, their old adversary from the desert, swept up the valley, but here it was different. It was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. It caught Eva's hair, whipping it around her face, and she laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She leaned into Caleb, her hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling the kick of the new life within. The train passed, its rhythmic clatter a comforting, transient sound against the great silence of the mountains. They watched until it was just a smudge of smoke on the horizon, heading west. Caleb looked at her, at the wind in her hair and the fierce, beautiful love in her eyes. He thought of all the waiting they had both done in their lives, the waiting for things lost, the waiting for things that would never come. And he knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the waiting was over. "No train is ever late," he said softly, his words a quiet truth spoken into the vast, open space, when we are still waiting for each other. She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. They stood there for a long time, watching as the last light of day painted the clouds in brilliant, fiery streaks of orange and red, a sky that was not an ending, but a glorious, breathtaking promise of the dawn that was to come. 10 years, a decade is a lifetime in the West, long enough for boomtowns to turn to ghost towns, for rivers to change their course, and for scars, both on the land and on the heart, to soften and fade into the landscape, for Caleb and Ava Hart. 10 years had been long enough to build a world. Forever Station was no longer just a cabin, but a sprawling, welcoming ranch that had become a landmark in the high mountain valley. The main house, built from the same golden pine Caleb had first felled, now had a wide uncovered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, its railings heavy with the fragrant, climbing white roses he had planted. The stable he had built now had a large corral and a barn attached, and the sound of his hammer on the anvil was a familiar, comforting music to travelers making their way over the Sierras. Ava's garden was a riot of color and life, providing vegetables for their table and for those who stopped, weary from the trail. They had not intended for their home to become a way station, but the world had a way of seeking out places of warmth and shelter. Word had spread of the quiet, decent couple who offered a clean bed, a hot meal, and a safe pasture for a fair price. And so the world came, the heart of Forever Station. However, was not the house or the barn, but the sound that often drifted from the porch in the late afternoon. It was the sound of a harmonica, played not with the mournful, hesitant notes of a man remembering his ghosts, but with the bright, breathless energy of a boy who had never known them. Eli Hart was 9 years old, a perfect fusion of his parents. He had his mother's thoughtful eyes and his father's quiet, self-contained strength. and he played the harmonica as if he had been born with it in his hands. Caleb had taught him, of course, but the boy had a natural gift, a joy in the music that was all his own. He would sit on the porch steps, his bare feet tapping in the dust, and play tunes that made the horses in the corral prick up their ears and the tired travelers on the porch tap their fingers. Ava watched him from the kitchen window, a pot of stew simmering on the stove, a gentle smile on her face. Her life was so full, so rich with the simple textures of love and labor, that the memory of her 40 days in Dry Creek often felt like a story she had read about someone else. Yet, it was her story, and she had claimed it. On the mantelpiece, above the great stone fireplace Caleb had built, sat a single, leather-bound book. Its title was embossed in simple gold letters, 40 Days at Dry Creek. She had written it not for fame or fortune, but for herself and for Eli. She wanted him to know the whole truth of where he came from, to understand that hope could be found in the most desolate of places, and that the strongest homes are often built on the foundations of a difficult past. One late summer afternoon, a family of 4 arrived, their wagon dusty and their faces etched with the fatigue of a long journey. The father, a man named Thompson, had the weary look of a farmer who had sold his land back east to chase the dream of California. His wife was pale and tired, and their 2 small children were asleep in the back of the wagon. Ava and Caleb welcomed them with their usual quiet hospitality. Ava settled the mother and children in a guest room, bringing them cool water and a plate of fresh-baked bread, while Caleb helped the father unhitch his tired team and lead them to the corral. Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, everyone gathered on the porch. The air was cool and smelled of pine. Eli was sitting on the steps, softly playing a lullaby on his harmonica for the 2 visiting children, who were now awake and watching him with wide, curious eyes. "Mr." Thompson looked around at the peaceful scene, at the well-tended ranch, at the happy, healthy boy, at the couple who stood together with an ease that spoke of a deep and unshakable bond. He had been a quiet man all evening, but now he cleared his throat, a hesitant look on his face. "Forgive me for asking," he said, his voice low, "but on the trail, we heard stories about this place, about you." He looked from Caleb to Ava. "They say you are the ones, the cowboy and the forgotten girl from the station." The question, asked so often by curious travelers, no longer held any sting for Eva. The phrase "the forgotten girl" was a part of a legend now, a character in a story. It had no power over her. She looked at the man, at his tired, hopeful face, and she smiled, a genuine smile of warmth and wisdom. "I was not forgotten," she said, her voice clear and gentle as the evening air. "I was just waiting for the right person." As she spoke, Caleb, who had been leaning against a porch post, pushed himself off and went inside the house without a word. The farmer and his wife looked confused, as if they had caused an offense, but Ava's smile never wavered. A moment later, Caleb returned. He was holding the small, pine-framed train ticket. He walked over to the small table that stood between the porch chairs and set it down. The evening light caught the glass, illuminating the faded ink of the old ticket to Wyoming. It sat there, a humble, sacred object, the seed from which their entire world had grown. Caleb looked at his wife, then at their guests, his expression one of quiet, profound certainty. "The ticket to forever," he said, his voice a low rumble that was as solid and as true as the mountains at his back, "has never expired." A deep and peaceful silence settled over the porch, a moment of perfect understanding that transcended words. The farmer and his wife looked at the ticket, then at the couple before them, and they finally understood that they were not just in the presence of a legend, but in the presence of a great and enduring love. The sun finally slipped behind the highest peak, and the valley was plunged into the soft, purple light of twilight. The stars began to appear, cold and bright in the vast, dark sky. From the steps, Eli, sensing the quiet, solemn mood, changed his tune. He began to play a simple, haunting melody, the one his father had taught him, the one that spoke of lonely trails and distant campfires, but also of resilience and of hope. The notes drifted out from the porch, a small, human sound that filled the great, silent valley. The music was a prayer, a testament, a story of its own. It was the sound of a life that had come full circle. It was the sound of home. Perhaps love in the West does not begin with a vow, but with a ticket and the courage to get on board. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.